One of the safest forms of travel is on a commercial airliner. Over decades, there's been a consistent decline in the accident rate within the global airline industry. Right now, there are 1.35 accidents per million flights. And note that I said accidents, not crashes. Accidents happen on the ground, too. We don't hear a lot about them because, while there may be damage, nobody got hurt. But let's stick with the worst-case scenarios. In 2023, there were 270 fatalities in commercial jet crashes worldwide. To put that into perspective, there are, on average, just over 101,000 flights per day. So we're talking 270 fatalities over an entire year. Compare that to the olden days, when there were insurance counters and machines at every airport. Now think about that. You're about to get on a plane, and for a few bucks, you could buy insurance against death or injury if that plane you were about to get on crashed. Today's situation reflects the introduction of better aircraft, better technology in the air and on the ground, better air traffic control, better training, more scrutiny and oversight with maintenance, improved safety management and data analytics, global safety standards, and enhanced safety protocols when it comes to ensuring that everybody who goes up also comes down in one piece. This underscores this maxim. When a plane lands safely, it's not news. Therefore, when a plane crashes today, it is big news. Then there are the crashes that don't involve a big jetliner. Statistically speaking, smaller private aircraft are more at risk. There are fewer deaths, but more crashes. There are less than 0.01 fatalities per 100,000 hours flown on a large commercial jet. But when we look at private aircraft, the number jumps from 0.01 to 2.3 fatalities per 100,000 hours. Why would this happen? Well, smaller planes mean that they're more vulnerable to what happens in the sky. On the ground, it's the difference between being in a cab of an 18-wheeler and on a 10-speed bike. Things like maintenance, inspections, and crew fatigue may be different. Of course, even one fatality is too many. Every crash is a tragedy. And when the accident involves someone famous, well, that is news. I'm Alan Croce, and this is episode number 26 of Uncharted: Crime and Mayhem in the Music Industry. And we're going to look at two private plane crashes that people still talk about. And there's plenty of mayhem with these stories. What do Buddy Holly, the Big Bopper, Ritchie Valens, Patsy Cline, Jim Croce, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Ricky Nelson, and Stevie Ray Vaughn all have in common? They all died when the private aircraft in which they were flying crashed. Holly, the Big Bopper, and Valens were on a single-engine 6-seater Beechcraft Bonanza when it went down in bad weather in an Iowa cornfield in February 1959. Cline and two other musicians died in March 1963 when their 6-seater Piper Comanche went down. Bad weather was to blame there, too. Jim Croce was on board an 11-seater Beechcraft twin-engine when it hit a tree on takeoff from an airport in Louisiana. Blame fog and pilot error. In October 1977, a chartered Convair CV-240 carrying members of Lynyrd Skynyrd and their crew somehow ran out of gas and crashed into a Mississippi swamp. I tell that story on episode 1 of this podcast. December 3rd, 1985, Ricky Nelson was in an old DC-3 when a heater on the plane caught fire and it crash-landed in a Texas cow pasture. And Stevie Ray Vaughn was in a helicopter leaving a Wisconsin music festival on August 27, 1990. It ended up all over the side of a ski hill. It was foggy, and while the pilot was certified to fly a fixed-wing aircraft under such conditions, he wasn't licensed to fly a helicopter. There are many more examples, but I think I've made my point. On this episode, I want to take a close look at two private plane crashes that are still widely discussed. There's the accident that nearly killed Blink-182 drummer Travis Barker and did kill several other people. But we'll start with the crazy story of the aircraft accident that killed Ozzy Osbourne guitarist Randy Rhoads.
I'm going off the rails on a crazy train. I'm going off the rails on a crazy train.
When Ozzy was kicked out of Black Sabbath in 1979, it looked like he was done. He was bought out for £96,000 and told to get lost. He spent the next 3 months spending that money on booze and coke. But then British manager Don Arden came to the rescue. He sent his daughter Sharon out to Los Angeles to sort Ozzy out. It wasn't easy, but with Don managing him and Sharon looking after him, Ozzy returned with a band that he called Blizzard of Oz. It was a supergroup of sorts, with Ozzy out front, bass player Rob Daisley of Rainbow, keyboardist Don Airey, also of Rainbow, Uriah Heep drummer Lee Kerslake, and a hotshot guitarist from Quiet Riot named Randy Rhoads. Randy was tiny, all of 5'7", maybe 105 pounds, but he was a wizard with a guitar. Starting at age 7, he trained as a classical guitarist at his mother's Musonia School of Music, where he also learned the intricacies of music theory from his mom via the piano. He eventually moved on to another teacher, but quickly exhausted that guy's ability to teach him anything. He was that good. Randy and his brothers were always into the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. But then he discovered Alice Cooper. It was July 11th, 1971, when he saw Alice live for the first time, and that was a big influence. He then started playing gigs, and by the mid-70s, Randy and his friend formed Quiet Riot. After a couple of albums with them, things got pretty sour. Kelly Garney, a guy that he'd known since elementary school, hatched a bizarre plot to murder singer Kevin Dubrow, which got him fired. When word came that Ozzy was auditioning players for his new band, Randy reluctantly went to try out. When he showed up, Ozzy was super drunk. But whatever Rhoads did was enough to impress Ozzy, and he got the gig. Randy flew to England to start rehearsals, but didn't have the proper work visa, so he spent the night in jail. But somehow Don Arden sorted that out. And for a while, the young Randy lived with Ozzy and his then-wife, Thelma. Ozzy, Randy, and the whole band clicked right away, resulting in an album entitled Blizzard of Oz. Rhoads was the co-writer of most of the songs, and when it was released in September 1980, it was a massive hit. One of the things everyone noticed was the guitar playing of Randy Rhoads. His licks were different, his guitar tones were different, and his solos were wow. Rhoads also employed his music theory training. He'd grown bored with metal songs all written in the key of A or E, so he made it a rule that every song had to be in a different key. It was a subtle move that most fans wouldn't have picked up on, but it gave the album a feel that was different from most metal records.
You gotta believe in foolish miracles. It's not how you play the game, it's if you win or lose. You can't choose.
The Blizzard of Oz album was a top 10 hit in Canada and the UK, and even though it reached only number 21 on the American charts, it sold more than 5 million copies. Ozzy got most of the glory, of course, but people noticed Randy. All those hours of classical training had helped him create a very distinctive playing style. Not only did his guitars have great tones, and not only did he play some fantastic riffs, but there were also technical aspects to his style that attracted attention. Randy was particularly good at something called the dive bomb. This is when the guitarist uses the whammy bar to quickly lower the pitch of a note. It kind of sounds like a bomb dropping. Let's have a listen to part of his performance in Crazy Train. You can see why guitarists love this guy. Sharon Arden, Ozzy's manager and soon-to-be wife, fired half of Ozzy's band before the second album, Diary of a Madman. The one guy who survived was Randy Rhoads. Now, Randy wasn't happy about this and almost quit in response, but he was talked out of it. So he stayed, taking on a couple of tutors in classical guitar to further help him with his technique. He was so deep into this study that he seriously considered quitting rock altogether to attend UCLA in order to earn a degree in classical guitar. He might in fact have done that, but then he died. Randy not only figured in the writing of all the songs on Diary of a Madman, but he also co-produced the record. There were several songs from the album that have become hard rock staples, and the whole thing features more of Randy's distinctive guitar sounds and classical influenced playing. By early 1982, Randy was fed up with Ozzy's real-life madman act. Too many drugs, too much alcohol, too many canceled shows when Ozzy was too wasted to perform, and too much unpredictability. Randy considered himself to be a super serious, very professional musician, and this was not how he wanted to make a living. Besides, he didn't use drugs after some bad experiences with coke in the 1970s, and he barely drank. He did smoke, a lot, too much, but he didn't seem to be too concerned about the health effects. Plans were made for Ozzy and the band to record a live album of Black Sabbath covers at Maple Leaf Gardens in Toronto during the Diary of a Madman tour, which began in Germany in November 1981. The album recording date was set for early February. Randy and drummer Tommy Aldridge hated the idea because this would basically relegate them to being members of a cover band. There was a big fight, and both guys were temporarily fired by Ozzy when he was in a drunken stupor. When he sobered up, he forgot that he'd fired them. In the end, both Randy and Tommy agreed to appear on this covers album, but they weren't happy about it. But the show in Toronto never happened. At some point, Randy went to Ozzy and Sharon and said, "Look, I'm out. I know that I'm contractually required to play on one more album and to go out on one more tour, and I will. But after that, I am done." The Madman Tour chugged on for a few more weeks before pulling into the Civic Auditorium in Knoxville, Tennessee on Thursday, March 18, 1982. The band tore through 17 songs, ending with Sabbath's Paranoid. That would be the last song Randy Rhoads would ever play in public. After the Ozzy Osbourne gig in Knoxville, Tennessee on March 18, 1982, everybody associated with the tour piled into their trucks and buses and hit the road for the next show in Orlando. On the morning of the 19th, everyone stopped at Flying Baron Estates in Leesburg, Florida, which is where the bus company, the Calhoun Brothers Tour Bus Company, had a maintenance garage. One of the buses had a bad AC unit that needed to be fixed, and since this was very near the Orlando venue, it was convenient. Flying Baron Estates, as you can tell from the name of this housing development, also had a small airstrip with private planes and helicopters. While Ozzy, Sharon, and most of the crew slept, Randy and Andrew Aycock, one of the bus drivers, decided to have a little fun. Aycock had his private pilot's license for single and twin-engine planes, with 1,500 flying hours under his belt. "Want to go for a ride?" he asked Randy. "You know I'm afraid of flying," he replied. "No problem," Aycock said. "We'll go up, make a couple of circuits around the airfield, and then bring it right down." Aycock somehow gained access to a single-engine, 6-seat 1954 Piper Beechcraft F-35, registered to someone named Mike Parton. He had not given permission to anyone to take this plane, so basically, Aycock stole it. He stole the plane. By the way, this was exactly the same kind of plane that Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper died in. We later learned that the plane hadn't been flown in at least a year and hadn't had its annual inspection. Aycock and Rhoads were joined by keyboardist Don Airey and tour manager Jake Duncan. It was basically an aerial joyride. At one point, Aycock flew the plane very close to the tour bus where Tommy Aldridge was sleeping. "Let's wake him up," he said. This freaked out the passengers because this was not supposed to be part of the plan. After a couple of close passes at treetop level, Aycock landed the plane to let Airey and Duncan out and allowed makeup artist Rachel Youngblood to board. She had a bad heart, but again was assured by Aycock that things would be just fine. Bass player Rudy Sarzo was also invited, but he decided that he'd rather get more sleep. Despite his fear of flying and the crazy buzzing of the bus, Randy chose to stay on board because he wanted to take some aerial photographs for his mother. It's on this second flight where things went very wrong. The plane took off to the southeast, made a turn to the left on a westward heading. Then, Aldridge's tour bus was buzzed once and then twice. A third approach happened about 10 a.m. This time, the plane, which was banking hard to the left and only a dozen or so feet above the ground, had its left wing clip the roof of the tour bus. The wing broke in two and sent the plane spiraling through the air. That maneuver caused Randy and Rachel's heads to smash through the plane's windscreen. The plane continued through the air before severing the top of a pine tree, crashing into a garage of a nearby house, and bursting into flames. The impact woke everybody up. Tommy Aldridge grabbed a fire extinguisher and ran towards the house where the plane was burning. But there was nothing anybody could do. Randy, Aycock, and Youngblood were all killed instantly. The crash and the fire were so bad that each of them could only be identified by dental records and the jewelry that they were wearing. The only member of the entourage to witness the crash was Don Airy, who had been up in the plane just a few minutes earlier. Here's his statement. I had my camera and was taking photos of the plane to give to Randy afterwards. I had my telephoto lens on and could tell that there was some sort of struggle going on aboard the plane. The wings were rapidly tipping from side to side. At one point, the plane was almost perpendicular, no more than 6 feet off the ground. That's when I put down my camera and saw the plane right in front of me. I quickly crouched to avoid getting hit and looked over my shoulder and watched it clip the bus, crash into the tree, and explode on impact into the garage. Airy also said that he saw Randy struggling with Aycock in the cockpit seconds before the Beechcraft hit the bus. Again, it's only 6 feet off the ground. There was plenty of confusion. It took about half an hour for help to arrive. There were conflicting news reports about what happened. Ozzy disappeared and was found later sobbing in the front row of an empty church. As is the case with all plane crashes, the National Transportation Safety Board was called in to investigate. Meanwhile, other stories started coming up. First, Andrew Aycock was having marriage issues. He was estranged from his wife, Wanda, but she was on one of the tour buses because she wanted a ride to Orlando. He desperately wanted to reconcile with her, and things may have not been going well. On the plane's third and fatal approach towards the bus, Wanda stepped outside. Don Airy and Rudy Sarzo have a theory. Aycock saw his wife and then intentionally and impulsively decided to dive bomb into her and the bus. Sarzo thinks that the struggle he saw in the cockpit was Randy's attempt to keep the plane from flying directly into her and the bus in some kind of murder-suicide mission. However, we must be clear. There were no reports of any kind of a fight between Aycock and Wanda that morning or on the ride down from Knoxville. Sarzo also spoke of Aycock's emotional state that day. He was sleep-deprived from the long drive from Knoxville and was known to pick himself up with a couple of bumps of cocaine. He allegedly wasn't in a good frame of mind. An autopsy on Aycock did reveal that he had coke in his system, and he should not have been driving a bus, let alone flying a plane. More facts. The NTSB quickly determined that the cause of the crash was pilot error during a reckless aerobatic maneuver. The report also noted that while Aycock was a licensed commercial pilot with instrument ratings on both single and twin-engine planes, his aviation medical certificate had expired, so that means he was not legally allowed to fly anything that day. When was Aycock's last flight review? No one could determine that. And as far as anyone could determine, he hadn't been up in a plane in a very long time. Stories also revealed that 6 years earlier, in 1976, Aycock was allegedly the pilot in another fatal crash near Dubai. It was a helicopter incident where one of the kids of the tour bus company's owners died. Only Sharon knew about that, but hadn't told anyone. Had she been awake at the time Aycock made the suggestion for the joyride, you'd like to think that she would probably have tried to stop it. Another theory. Rachel Youngblood suffered some kind of cardiac event while sitting in the front passenger seat. Maybe she jerked and seized some of the flight controls. We don't know. Randy was buried in Mountain View, California. The inscription on his tomb reads, "An inspiration for all young people." Randy Rhoads was just 25 when he died. He died because an uncertified pilot high on coke stole a plane, flew it recklessly, and killed everyone on board. One guy who should have died in a plane crash but did not is Blink-182 drummer Travis Barker. He's okay, but he'll always have physical and mental scars. On September 19, 2008, Travis performed with one of his Blink-182 side projects in Columbia, South Carolina. The band was Travis DJ AM. Two guys, Travis and Adam Goldstein, better known as DJ AM. And they sounded like this. Just before midnight, everybody boarded a Learjet 60 for a flight to Van Nuys, California, at Columbia Metropolitan Airport. Travis's wife was supposed to come with him, but she said she had a freaky feeling and didn't want to go, so she stayed behind. The passenger manifest included Travis, DJ AM, and 2 friends, Charles Still and Chris Baker. The Learjet 60 is a very reliable, mid-sized, medium-range business aircraft made by Bombardier, a Canadian company, and powered by 2 Canadian-built Pratt & Whitney engines. It has a crew of 2, a passenger capacity of 8, and a range of over 4,000 kilometers. It can fly as high as 51,000 feet. At least 400 of these jets have been in service all over the world, and to my knowledge, this model has been involved in exactly 1 fatal incident. This one. This particular Learjet was only 2 years old and owned by a charter company called Global Exec Aviation. It had been in the air less than 110 hours and had gone through just 123 takeoffs and landings. But something went very wrong on takeoff number 124. At the controls that night was Captain Sarah Lemon, a 31-year-old pilot with over 3,100 flight hours. But only 35 of those hours were on the Learjet 60, although the last time she'd flown the jet was a month earlier. And of those 35 hours, she was the pilot in command for only 8 hours. So, not a lot of experience, and that's something that will come up later in this story. Meanwhile, the first officer was 52-year-old James Bland. He had 8,200 flight hours, and about 300 of those hours were on this particular type of business jet. Although this was an overnight flight, it appears that both the captain and the first officer were well rested. They were also the crew that repositioned the aircraft to Columbia from Teterboro Airport in New Jersey to pick up their next clients. And on that flight down from Jersey, everything seemed to be in fine working order. The plane touched down in Columbia at around 10:30 to pick everybody up. The passengers got on board, the pilots performed their checks, and preparations were made for departure. They seemed to be in a little bit of a hurry and were a little scattered about what to do about things like the catering of the aircraft. The passengers got a short safety briefing that might have been slightly incomplete, according to those on board. Charles Still and Chris Baker were at the front of the cabin in seats 1 and 3. Seats 2, 4, and 5 were empty. DJ AM was in one of the very back seats, seat 7, and Travis was across the aisle from him in seat 8. Both Travis and DJ AM were immediately adjacent to an overwing exit. They had no idea that where everyone chose to sit determined whether they'd live or die. Just before midnight on September 19, 2008, under clear, mostly calm conditions, Lemon and Bland taxied the plane to runway 11 with the 4 people in the cabin. There seemed to be some sort of confusion in the cockpit about the taxi instructions, but they were quickly sorted out. Runway 11 heads in an easterly direction. At the end of the 8,600-foot runway, there's a grass strip separating it from South Carolina Highway 302, and on the other side of the highway was an embankment. The Learjet commenced its takeoff roll with Captain Lemon in charge. As the plane accelerated towards 100 miles an hour, there was a loud thump captured by the cockpit voice recorder at exactly 11:55 and 12 seconds. We'd later learn that that was the sound of one of the right side main gear tires exploding. The plane continued to accelerate. The first officer, aware of the speed of the aircraft, says, "Go, go, go!" He knows that aborting the takeoff is no longer in the cards. The captain says, "No, we're not going." There's an obvious disconnect between the captain and the co-pilot. It's the wrong decision. Sparks started coming out from the bottom of the plane. Bland, the first officer, managed to radio air traffic controllers that they were aborting the takeoff and asked that emergency equipment be dispatched. "Roll the equipment," he says. "We're going off the end." But it was too late. The Learjet started violently swaying back and forth. It was clearly out of control. And by the time it reached the end of the runway, it was still moving very fast. It hit some runway lights, roared over the grass strip, crashed through a fence, crossed the highway, and ended up against the 45-degree embankment on the far side of the highway. It immediately burst into flames, and because it was carrying a full fuel load for the cross-country flight, there was a lot of fuel to burn. Captain Lemon and First Officer Bland died of smoke inhalation and severe burns. Passengers Still and Baker were immediately killed on impact, blunt force trauma. And yes, in case you're asking, they did appear to have their seatbelts fastened. The biggest misfortune for them was to be at the front of the cabin and right next to a bulkhead, and on impact, the bolts holding their seats let go, and they just flew through the air. Travis and DJ AM were at the back with plenty of legroom in front of them and facing two empty, well-padded seats. Their seats remained bolted to the floor. Travis was still conscious and tried to go forward to the front of the plane to save his two friends. That's when he caught fire and had to find a way out. He returned to the back of the plane and popped out the emergency overwing exit. Travis and DJ AM slid down the wing, but by the time they got to the ground, they were both covered in burning jet fuel. And just as they got out, the plane exploded and more jet fuel covered them. DJ AM knew to drop and roll to put out the fire, but Travis freaked out and instinctively ripped off all his clothes and was late dropping and rolling to the ground, so he burned a lot longer. It was only when a passing driver on the highway the plane crossed jumped out of his car and tried to help that he managed to get Travis onto the ground and rolling so the fire would be put out.
There were two people out of the plane. We're going to presume that was Travis Barker and DJ AM, both trying to put the flames out on each other.
Compounding problems was that the highway, which the plane crossed, was also on fire. There was that much jet fuel. While fire trucks were on hand within minutes, it was 45 minutes before EMS responders could get close enough to the plane to attend to the dead and the injured. It was the beginning of a long ordeal for Travis, and the beginning of trauma that would lead to DJ AM's death a year later. We'll pick it up there in a moment. As with all plane crashes, the National Transportation Safety Board was called in to investigate the accident that took the life of 4 people and severely injured Blink-182 drummer Travis Barker and his buddy DJ AM. Let's get into the cause of the crash. After recovering the cockpit voice recorder, there was no flight data recorder on this aircraft. Investigators determined that the jet's tires were severely underinflated and had not been checked for 3 weeks. Since these particular tires regularly lose 2% of their pressure every day, it meant that they were sitting at around 140 psi on the night of the crash. Now that sounds like a lot, but these aircraft tires need to be inflated to 220 psi. If they lose pressure, you can't tell simply by looking at them, even if, as in this case, they were down 80 psi. And if you take a reading on the tires and you find that they've lost a substantial amount of pressure, you just can't pump them up with air. First, they have to be inflated with nitrogen, so they have to be replaced. And in the case of a Learjet 60, tires need to be changed about every 8 days. Because the landing gear on this plane was not checked, all 4 tires on the main gear, starting with the outside tire on the starboard side and finishing with the outside tire on the port side, all exploded within seconds of each other during the takeoff roll. The lack of pressure caused the sidewalls to flex, buckle, melt, and tear apart. They shredded into hundreds of pieces, some of which flew up into the fuselage and into the wheel wells of the landing gear at very high speeds. This damaged the jet's hydraulic systems, including everything that controlled the brakes. The debris also damaged the plane's thrust reversers, which actually fed more power to the engines, causing it to speed up. By the time Captain Lemon realized that something was wrong and decided to reject the takeoff, the plane was already traveling at 166 miles per hour. That was too fast. A Learjet 60 should not have a takeoff aborted above 157 miles per hour. And 157 miles per hour was exactly when the outside starboard tire exploded. In other words, the pilot should have pulled back on the stick and attempted takeoff and not gone for the abort. The speed of the aircraft meant that it was committed to flight, but Captain Lemon instead stood on the brakes as hard as she could. But of course, the brakes weren't working. Complicating matters was that the debris from the blown tires had also damaged the sensor that told the flight crew if they were on the ground or above it. So this complicated the pilot's understanding of where the plane was vertically. Another thing investigators learned was the plane was slightly overweight, maybe by about 300 pounds. Normally that wouldn't be much of a problem, but not in a situation like this. There was too much speed, too little runway, no brakes, a slightly overweight aircraft, and broken landing gear scraping the ground. Add in the inexperience of Captain Lemon on a Learjet 60 and the indecision she displayed during the emergency, a disaster was inevitable. It was touch and go for Travis for a very long time. He received burns to 65% of his body, He was in hospital burn units for nearly 3 months. He needed surgery 16 times. At one point, it looked like his left foot would have to be amputated. And then there was the PTSD, which, as you might guess, was pretty severe. He also ingested a bunch of jet fuel. He says he burped up jet fuel for 3 months following the accident. DJ AM also had second and third degree burns, although he was released from hospital weeks before Travis. But less than a year later, he was found dead in his apartment in New York. A drug overdose. Crack, cocaine, oxy, and a ton of other stuff. His friends say the trauma of the crash caused him to relapse into drugs. The plane crash killed him, they maintained. It just took a year. There were plenty of lawsuits, including a suit filed by Travis and the estates of everyone else against Bombardier and Learjet. They also filed suit against the owners of the airplane, Goodyear, the people who made the tires, the airport, and the aircraft maintenance company that didn't inflate the tires properly. Everything has since been settled out of court. The only good thing about this whole incident, other than the fact that Travis survived, was that it spurred the reunion of Blink-182. A little over 3 years to the day from that crash, Blink-182 released an album called Neighborhoods.
And all these demons, they keep me up all night.
Travis Barker's issues with airplanes continued. While the other two guys flew from gig to gig, Travis stayed on the ground in a tour bus. For a tour of Europe, he took a cruise ship from the United States. Then he dropped out of a 2013 Australian tour because he was just too afraid to get on another plane. He didn't get on another plane until 2021. Travis knows how lucky he was. He now does volunteer work at places that look after other burn victims. He made some lifestyle choices. He started running and swimming. He went full vegan after leaving the hospital. He did develop a painkiller addiction, but he was able to get over that. Today, he still has some symptoms of PTSD, but he knows exactly how lucky he really was. Like I said at the beginning, air travel is extremely safe, but humans are prone to error and terrible judgment. And when those things lead to mechanical failures, the outcomes can be very, very bad. You can catch up on all episodes of Uncharted by downloading them from your favorite podcast platform. If you have any comments or questions about anything you hear on this podcast, just shoot me an email, alan@alancross.ca. We can also meet up on all the social media sites along with my website, ajournalofmusicalthings.com. It's updated with music news and recommendations every day. There's also the free daily newsletter that you should get. Oh, and please check out my other podcast, The Ongoing History of New Music, which deals with rock music at large. There are hundreds and hundreds of episodes that you can enjoy for free. See you next time for more stories of crime and mayhem in the music industry. Episodes arrive every 2 weeks. Technical production is by Rob Johnston. I'm Alan Cross.